Hello everyone, and welcome to my new podcast mini-series, A Penny for Your Thoughts on Sustainability. I have guests from all over the world and we'll be talking about their thoughts on sustainability and how they do their part to make the world a greener place. Thank you, Matthew, for taking the time to talk to me today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and seeing where we go. I think sustainability is a key issue that we all need to be taking responsibility for right now. I think there's been too long where we've pointed away from ourselves and tried to blame other people for why things are not working the way they should. So it'd be great to hear your views. If you wouldn't mind starting with a quick introduction of who you are and what you've been doing and why you're keen on this subject.
Kia ora, Steve. Thank you very much for reaching out. It's a real pleasure to chat. My current role is business development manager or senior manager here at the New Zealand Green Building Council, and it's actually my second time round at the Green Building Council. I came on board here when Homestar had just been launched, and Homestar is our residential rating tool which was created in New Zealand for New Zealand homes. And I had about nearly 3 years, I think, here back in 2011. And after that, I went and learned a bit about building surveying. I hadn't ever heard of building surveying, didn't know that it was a thing, but really enjoyed my time doing that and learning from that about building science. Mm-hmm. And then one thing led to another. Eventually I found Passive House. I did the Passive House training, and it's kind of that's brought me back here to the Green Building Council because of some of the developments that have happened with Homestar since then. So really enjoying that now.
Okay. And so when you first got into that space with the Green Building Council, what was it attracted you to coming into that sustainability area, I guess?
Well, I was already working for a organisation that was part of the Warm Up New Zealand campaign, which ECA ran from about 2006-07 were the first pilots. And that was the early campaign to get some insulation and heat pumps into homes that were subsidised. We were in Christchurch, and I was working for a company that started out doing energy efficient light bulbs and then diversified into a more whole home approach. So we ran a scheme to go in and do an assessment of people's homes and then give some advice and try and make it really easy for them to get everything from hot water cylinder wraps to draft stoppers to light bulbs, of course, but also to get their insulation in the roof topped up. If we could get under the floor, we were organised to get that insulated as well and install either a heat pump. It was usually a heat pump. Sometimes it was fuel efficient log burners, but mostly it was heat pumps. So I was kind of in that space already, and then that went through to 2010.
Right. Okay.
And there was an earthquake.
Yeah. I noticed that. Yeah.
So they kind of put people had a bit more to think about and other issues than not enough insulation in their roof after that. So things turned a bit pear-shaped. There were actually three things that happened around the same time. We pivoted a little bit in the company that I was with after the first earthquake in September, but when it came to the big February earthquake, things were sort of winding down. Everything was changing. An hour before that earthquake in February, the senior managers had all just been told that we were all going to be made redundant, and we were just about to call a meeting with the rest of the team to say, hey, we're winding things down, and the earthquake happened. I jumped on my bike and rode home. It was one of the through all the rubble that was sort of being created around me. It was well, buildings were falling down. There was flooding and stuff. It helped push a few people out of big puddles on my way home. And then later that day we were in the hospital where my wife thought she was going into labour with our third child. Turned out that he wasn't born until the following day. About 48 hours after that, we found ourselves in Wellington, having been extracted from Christchurch with a newborn baby. And I started looking for a new job. So that's kind of how I ended up in Auckland, working for the New Zealand Green Building Council, and we're still here.
Yeah. So Auckland's it's a good place to live. I think there's a lot going on up there, isn't there? So it's a great location, I think. So just going on to more sort of broader issues, from your perspective, what do you think that are the key things that are currently stalling our adoption of better building practices for sustainability and energy use in building?
There's a lot of momentum in the industry. That's always an issue of getting over that inertia of doing things the way we've always done them, and that comes from lots of different directions. Certainly the industry, the market, people, what companies are set up to supply in terms of design, services, but also products and materials. But there's also a lot of expectations of what we expect in our lifestyle, and to have the 2 cars and the reasonable size, probably unreasonable size really, house with all of the stuff that goes into that house. There's also a big issue so my area, my career has been in housing, and I don't know the answer completely, but I often talk about the confusion that we have between housing and real estate. And I think it's even more prevalent here in New Zealand because we don't have some of the breaks that there are in other countries around speculation and property investment and development. That those two things often get conflated, and that creates issues for things like affordability, which also has downstream impacts. Because of the sort of structural way that the industry is set up, those two are related. They don't have to be. We can have people doing really good businesses and having really prosperous, good lifestyles while not using up too many resources, but that's kind of not the way things are set up at the moment. So I wouldn't say there's one single thing. I think there are lots of different issues factors that are sort of keeping us in the direction which isn't always optimal for the planet.
Do you think that there's enough understanding of the implications of things like putting better insulation, putting thermally broken glazing into your houses, decent quality heating systems, that kind of thing? Do you think people really understand the downside of not having those things?
At some level, yes. I think there's also a lot of confusion between, I like to call it the confusion between effectiveness and efficiency. And most of our houses are not effective. And we need to get them effective first before we can actually start worrying about being efficient. Because you could argue that a lot of our houses are actually too efficient because they're underheated in winter and they're starting to overheat in summer.
Yep.
So some of our houses don't actually use enough energy. What we need to do is figure out how to keep that energy consumption at around about the level that it's at, but drastically improve the performance.
Right.
Because our houses are a health issue first and foremost.
Yeah.
And that is probably one of the other big barriers to sustainability in the environmental sense, is that they're not sustainable in a societal sense. They're not looking after people. They're not achieving the objectives of the Building Act or the Building Code because they are literally making people sick.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to touch on, because I've heard numbers in the region of $7 billion a year on respiratory illness as a result of poor housing.
Well, the cost of someone going into hospital, which happens more frequently than I think a lot of people are aware, is in the thousands. And if that person happens to need to be in an ICU or have a lot of attention because of asthma or a respiratory disease, which is one of the worst things other than the heart that you can be in hospital for, it's pretty urgent stuff, then those costs go up massively. And that was actually coming back to the Warm Up New Zealand campaign. The biggest benefit of that scheme, which was significant in the research that was done after it started to wind down, showed that there was anywhere between a $4 or $5 return on that government funding investment. So every dollar that we put in as taxpayers and as the government, the benefit to the country was around $5.
Yeah.
Most of that saving was health related. So it was keeping people out of hospital, but also all of the impacts that has when you have a sick child at home, you can't go to work, and productivity decreases. Yeah, it's massive. Tiny amount of that was actual energy saving. So you have a nice house, you put some insulation, you get a heat pump, your power bills goes down. That's the theory. That in fact only happens if you're using a reasonable amount of energy in the first place, and that only happens in quite a small portion of our homes, unfortunately, because a lot of people, like I say, aren't in a position to heat their homes adequately.
it costs too much. I mean, I know one of the houses we were living in Wellington when we first came to New Zealand, our worst electricity bill in 1 month was just over $1,100.
Which is nuts.
It's ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. And I mean, all of that was going straight out the windows and the walls. None of it was staying inside the house.
Yeah. So to your point, it costs too much, but it also is it gets to a point where it's pointless because like you say, that you're losing so much of that heat where people are making these decisions of which room do I bother heating. Mm-hmm. That is not a decision that you should have to make in a developed country. Growing up in a place like the UK, where you're used to having central heating. My wife's from Canada, where they have their homes in Canada, where it's deep winters are way warmer than homes.
Well, I mean, I just recall when we left the UK in 2010, and I don't know if you remember what it was like in 2010 in the UK, but the southeast had the coldest winter it ever had. It was minus 17 degrees outside our house in Kent. We had snow that was probably a metre and a half deep in our garden. And we had a pretty much fully glazed conservatory on the back of the house that was double glazed with thermally broken units, well insulated, one radiator in that room, and we were sitting inside that room in shorts and t-shirts, perfectly warm. You couldn't do that in New Zealand. You'd freeze to death.
No, I'm having conversations quite regularly now because in the latest version of Homestar, we've basically required thermally broken window frames. And builders continually talk to me and say, oh, this is too expensive. We don't need it. And, housing's expensive already. This is going to push the prices up. I have that conversation, and it's a frustrating one to have. I have it quite regularly.
Yeah. I mean, is that actually, again, I think there's a lack of understanding of the benefits across the whole of the life of the building, because you get rid of your issues around condensation, which causes which damages the house, that has to be repaired, all of those things, alongside the health issues as well. There's a double win really if you go for the thermally broken windows, I think.
So condensation is the main reason. When they say they're too expensive and you're never going to save that money, they're actually there's a truth in that, because if you've got a whole window, you've got a double pane of glass, that's actually pretty well insulated these days. Different qualities, different space materials, but in general, the glass piece, which is the most of the area of a window, is not too bad. It's the fact that we put that glass in a really, really conductive material. Like, it's quite hard to find a material that conducts heat better than aluminium. Yeah. That's a good thing when you're frying an egg. Really bad thing when you're using that as a thing that is supposed to protect you from what's going on outside. Because whatever the temperature is outside, the heat conducts so well that the indoor temperature of that surface will be pretty close to whatever is outside. When we have quite high humidity, which we do all across New Zealand, it doesn't take much for the interior temperature to drop down and you reach the dew point and get condensation on the inside. So the reason why we're so strong on things like thermally broken windows is more about reducing that condensation than it is about total heat loss, because the area of aluminium in your house is quite small, but those surfaces will be cold on the inside if they're not broken or detached somehow thermally from the outside.
Yeah. It's something that's been an issue for me since I've been here, because I'm so used to the way we build stuff in the UK with the standards we got over there. Coming here, it was like going back 2 decades in terms of the building standards, which is kind of frightening, really. Do you think that there's also, you talked about the status quo and moving that inertia, do you think that there's a sort of a vested interest in maintaining the status quo within the construction industry?
Yeah, I mean, we are a small island down the bottom of the world, so and with a relatively small population. So those industries that we all know, the companies that we all know, the suppliers into that market they've enjoyed a market that they've had more or less to their own for a little while. It has been hard for other companies to get established. That is starting to change, and I see specifiers, designers looking elsewhere and importing some quite good quality products from overseas. It's not always easy getting those through all the necessary
approvals and
requirements, some of which are more required than others to actually get used. But there are some really good materials available, and we can benefit in the same way that we can from importing cars and TVs and iPhones, there are actually some benefits to scale of production and efficiency from importing overseas. So as much as it's nice to have sort of Kiwi made and locally made, that's not necessarily the best option.
Yeah, there is a certain level of, if it's not made here, then it's not good enough, that I find in a number of different things, which does hold us back a little bit, because there's so much well thought out and well established technology that we could be relying on from elsewhere in the world. I mean, I've heard people discussing things like, well, the climate's different here, and therefore it doesn't work. And it's, well, actually, no, it's not.
No, really there's not. And there's I remember Sean McIsaac and others, Sean at Oculus, and there's some other people have done something similar where they've plotted across the main centres of New Zealand. So taken Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, and found places in the UK and Europe with a similar latitude, same rainfall data, similar sunshine days, and overlaid them on those locations, and basically shown that there are other places around the world that have very similar climates, which is not just about temperature. It's also those other things like rainfall, sunshine hours, relative humidity. I mean, we are a wet country because we're a little island surrounded by a huge amount of water. So our relative humidity is quite high relative to our latitude, but we don't account for that in the way we build.
No, and I think the other issue got, because we haven't got the mass of Europe around it, we do have quite a high variation in daytime temperatures.
Yep.
That is, I mean, when I say quite a high, it's double what you see in Europe. You generally allow for about 8 degrees diurnal variation in Europe, and over here you can get 16 to 18 degrees variation in a day. Yeah, which in itself is something the buildings need to be designed for, because that massive change results in a massive energy flow in one direction or the other. So I think there's some learnings there that need to be taken as well, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think is I guess the key things that we should be doing right now that we're not doing from your perspective?
Specifically for the industry, for the building industry, we need to get this thing called the Building for Climate Change Framework, which MB put out. It's the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. They look after the building sector, and they put out this draft document. And unfortunately, they put it out at around about the same time as they were putting out consultation documents for our H1 clause, which is the energy efficiency part. And this was back in 2018, 2019. It's been out for quite a while now. And then, of course, COVID happened. The process of the H1 updates went through the consultation rounds. It's been implemented, and coming up to November this year will be the final stage of the full implementation. That was actually delayed as well. That should have been done and dusted already. That bumped up the insulation requirements. Now, Building for Climate Change Framework fundamentally changes the way that energy calculation or insulation requirements will be calculated, but it also includes some really important changes, primarily around both operational carbon and embodied carbon in homes. It also looks at there's a water efficiency component in there, and it tapers off the use of fossil fuel burning. It's a really good piece of what would be implementation of the building code. It's a really good framework, as it's called. It's based on something that's been very similar and successful in places like Vancouver, so much so that the rest of British Columbia have rolled out a similar sort of roadmap style of changes. In New Zealand, we've had this ad hoc way of changing our building code. So in Australia, there's a 2-year cycle. Every year the National Construction Code there gets updated. What the Energy Step Code did in Vancouver was lay out a plan for about a decade, a 10-year period, with incremental steps along the way. And it made it really easy for the industry to know where things were going, and then they could decide how far down the track they wanted to go with their planning and their procurement, because they knew where the goalposts were going to be at what particular time. And that's a much better way of giving confidence and clarity to the industry. So the Building for Climate Change Building for Climate Change framework does that. It sets new benchmarks, but it does them in incremental steps. There's an initial cap, an intermediate cap, and then a final cap that are all driving us and helping us achieve our emission reduction targets.
Okay, and what's the status of that document at the moment then?
That's a very good question. It's kind of hanging in limbo, and so the real thing we need to do, one of the key priorities is for us to get that done. MB does have an implementation plan, but everything's a little bit on ice at the moment, at least until October. We're a little bit
after the election.
We're just kind of figuring out what's going to happen. I mean, we do have this fixed point of our commitments that we've made as a country, so we need to figure that out, and at least 20% of that is from the construction industry. So we have a significant part to play. And in fact, if we did that in the construction industry, if we got our emissions down, that would be the bulk of our total commitments as a country done. So we can play a pretty significant role in that.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, we generate a lot of emissions from the energy we use, not only in building the buildings, but in running the buildings as well. So, there is definitely something incumbent on us in the construction industry to build efficiently and sustainably. And I think that we sometimes lose sight of that in the rush to get the job done.
New Zealand's a little bit unique. The figure for that most of the rest of the world used, in fact, they've just bumped it up in America from 40% to 42 or 43%. But globally, buildings account for around 40% of emissions, and most of that is in operational use. Now, New Zealand, the reason why our figure is more around the 15 to 20% figure is because so much of our energy comes from water in dams.
Yep.
So that just doesn't have the same emissions factor as burning coal or gas, which is much more prevalent in the grids around the world. But that's not a reason for us to sort of rest on our laurels and think, we don't need to do anything. We're only half that of the rest of the country. It's still 20%, and that operational carbon is still significantly higher over the life of the building than the embodied carbon that goes into the construction of the building. Yep. But it's also not just about the individual buildings. It's about the way we design and build our cities. And the more we sprawl, that has an impact on our total emissions as well, because you require then more asphalt, more concrete, more horizontal infrastructure, but also just making people drive more.
That's one of the things I was going to touch on, is that there's been there's a lot of talk globally about livable cities and making cities that are where everything you need is within a 20-minute walk or cycle from where you live. I think that Christchurch in particular had a great opportunity to focus more on that than I think it did. There has been some effort to try and do that with the frames that have been built with the housing around the outside of the city. But we're still heavily reliant. And all we've got to do is look at the number of car parks in the centre of Christchurch. We're so reliant on our vehicles in New Zealand, and there seems a real reluctance to get rid of the cars. And that's a big part, I think, of us living more sustainably, is how we transport ourselves.
Cycling across Christchurch back from all through university, from 2003 right up through when I was working in 2007, I remember being in more and more cycling traffic and really enjoying the fact that I was in cycle traffic and seeing some really good infrastructure being put in place, some good cycle lanes. And then a lot of that disappeared, of course. There was lots of emergency stuff done just to get people moving. Most people needed four-wheel drives for a few years to get around all the cones, and it was tough. But I think you're right, that did create a bit of a blank slate across a lot of that to create a much better infrastructure. I'm really pleased with some of the new cycle paths that have been put in place here in Auckland. I think what we struggle with a little bit at the moment, and I'm no traffic engineer, is that there's been a tendency to make gold-plated cycle paths in certain areas, and then in other places there's nothing. And so we end up with these beautiful, like along Tamaki Drive is just incredible now, which is great if you're going that way. But we need a bit more of a connected up network. Now that's going to take time. It's not hard to. It's a hard thing to retrofit any sort of infrastructure to an existing city. But I'd like to see more cycle paths and pedestrian centered city centres and town centres that are all connected up in a better way, and less sort of really sort of gold plated short segments of it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There is a lot that we can do outside of building our buildings better that's going to certainly reduce our impact around us. But I think the other thing I've seen is I've got 3 grown children, 20, 22 and 24, and their view on travel is very different to mine. They're much more thinking, well, why do I want a car? I don't need a car really. And I couldn't imagine, and this is part of the issue. I think I couldn't imagine being without a car because of the convenience it brings. It's trying to change that attitude is kind of a generational thing. I think we're in the middle of a transition, and I think the people that's coming after us are going to be fully engaged in what we need to be doing to save the planet. Probably a generation too late for some of the impacts we're seeing, but I think there's definitely more activism in my kids than I remember when me at their age, and I think that's can only be a good thing, because we need the generation that's coming through to be really engaged in this space and really taking responsibility, because I think that's been part of the issue has been we've tried to blame other people all the time.
There has been some good leadership. One of the great developers that we've worked with here is Mark Todd of Ockham, and I remember years ago him doing a great presentation at one of our housing summits, talking about the concept of medium density design, but with green space, and the fact that you can get people into a smaller area, but not feel like a ghetto and not be a shoebox apartment, but actually have more density, but still with an element of luxury and also some open space and green space. One of his biggest challenges in one of the developments that he proposed and eventually got built was he decided that he wasn't going to give every apartment a car park. And that was a requirement. He had to battle with the council to say, I am not going to put a car park in for every single apartment. The council said, no, you can't do that, because the council was worried that then that would create street parking. And Mark Todd, to his credit, he stood his ground. He said, no, we're not going to do that. That's not the future. And since then, other developers followed suit, and there have been some great examples of that sort of more whole sustainable thinking, not just about more insulation, better windows, but putting in bike infrastructure, putting medium density buildings next to really good public transport infrastructure and near shopping centres. That's the sort of joined up thinking that we need to essentially retrofit our urban spaces to become more people centred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and do you think, one of the things I was going to ask, do you think that there's how much of this change that we need to make is going to be driven by the private sector and how much by the public sector?
I think it's always going to be a bit of both. I think the degree to which the public sector and rule changes come on board just determines how fast it's going to happen. I think eventually you get people like Mark Todd, and now we're seeing Sam Stubbs from Simplicity doing some really, really innovative stuff with build for rent schemes. Some of the other developers as well are sort of getting on board and seeing there's a Hallmark Homes down your way in Christchurch doing some fantastic work in the sort of private builder space. They've been a big adopter of Homestar. So you're going to get those sort of private market sort of seeing where things are going and getting there. But we really, it's really helpful to have the rules changed to bring up the bottom, because the leaders will improve the very top and what's best practice. But we really need to sort out just that.
We need to raise the bar.
We need to raise the bar, because our buildings, like I said at the beginning, they're not actually doing the job of sheltering people and looking after people.
Keeping them healthy. That's something I see from the guys I do quite regularly on LinkedIn, is everybody's entitled to a healthy home, and we don't seem to be able to provide that at the moment, which is that seems to be the minimum standard. It's like the living wage. Why isn't the living wage the minimum wage? There's a disconnect there between what we know we need to do and what we actually do. And
well, there's a disconnect in the objectives of the Building Act and the Building Code, which says that buildings should be healthy and and not cause people harm, basically.
Yeah.
And they're not. So somewhere between the very top line of the building code and the implementation of that, which happens through the individual clauses and the acceptable solutions that we have in place, is where it starts to fall apart. Because if we were actually true to those objectives, we wouldn't have half of our homes with mold in them right now. And we wouldn't have condensation just accepted as normal in a brand new home in New Zealand. And that's what we have. I have colleagues here who bought a brand new home. They've taken photos of it and said, Matt, what am I doing wrong? Why has my house got condensation in it? And I said, you're not doing anything wrong. It's a brand new New Zealand home.
And that's what they do.
It doesn't have any ventilation. That's your problem.
Yeah. Well, my house was built in 2017, and so it's pretty new, and we've had condensation from day one in every room. It's unnecessary.
Which is almost a case. I mean, I've been thinking for a while. It's almost a case of some sort of class action, because if it was any other consumer item, you would take it back and return it and say it's not
good enough.
It's not doing what it says on the box, which our houses are not. But that seems like too much of that can't be true.
Who would you be having a go at, though? I mean, where does that class action go? The builders are building to a code.
That's their get out clause. Is that we just but we've seen this before. We've been down this path. That was the whole leaky building crisis. It's like the builders. I did what I was told. The designer said, well, I did what the manufacturer. I followed their specifications and so on. Everyone's sort of pointing the finger at everyone else.
It's kind of I mean, that's what I'm saying about people taking responsibility. Really, that's a lot of the issues we have, is that we don't want to be responsible for things like this because it's too difficult. It's in the too hard box, and we want somebody else to fix it for us. And I think that needs to stop, because speaking to a few people on this subject, there's a lot of accountability that needs to be. We're too quick to blame the big corporations for all the wrongs in the world, but we put ourselves in those corporations. We could stand up and say no, and we could have more of a voice than we do. And I think there's a level of reluctance to rock the boat to some extent, I think. And on the flip side to that, just in a more positive light, something that I've got a real buzz of from in my sort of last, probably 10 years, is meeting people, mostly builders actually, who are quite experienced. They've been around for a while. They're open about the fact that they used to build just the way they were taught to build. And then they come across something like Passive House or Homestar. And it's usually from a client who says, we've heard about this thing and we want to import these windows, and we want to build an airtight home, and we want to do this, that, and that. And that's the first time the builder's ever heard it. It's like, no, that's crazy. But eventually the client talks the builder into going down this path. And I've seen the light in these builders' eyes who were starting to get a little bit tired and a little bit sort of worn down by the industry that they've been in for so long. And suddenly they remember why they became a builder in the first place. And they just are so proud of the building that they've just built, which is something that they haven't experienced for a while, because they sort of realize they get into a bit of a commodity style of just pumping out another house. But then they get to build something that they're actually proud of. And I've had that happen to me a few times, and I think there's something in that. There's something that, about giving someone the space, because I think people do want to do, most people want to do good work. And by giving them the understanding, the tools, and the right client helps, but also the right knowledge to do something that they can be proud of. I think that's a real key, because that's a real motivator for change, because every single one of those people won't go back to the way they were doing things before. They just say, this is me now. If I get a client who says, I just want to code compliant, I tell them to go down the road and talk to someone else. So the more people that get that chance to either experience a home that actually works properly, or if they're in the industry, to be part of that a project like that, it only sort of takes one or two of those projects for them to say, this is the direction that we're now going in. It does make a huge difference. If your house works well, there's a lot of differences you just don't notice, but you sleep better, you feel better when you're in the house. One of the things I find, if it's not ventilated properly, you can get quite tired because you're not, you've got no oxygen coming into the house. It tends to be all the very unsexy stuff that makes all the difference. And most of the stuff that makes the difference you can't actually see when the house is finished, because it's the vapor control layer, it's the air tightness layer,
it's the ventilation and all the ducting and the filters and the insulation.
Yeah.
All that stuff gets covered up by a plasterboard, and you get distracted by fancy taps and bathrooms.
Yes.
But so, the best time to actually sell a well-performing house is just before the plasterboard goes on. And when it's just
behind the scenes,
when it's just being closed in. And I know of builders who that's their sales strategy now. So they basically have an open day when they've just closed the house in. And the best time to do that is in the middle of winter. You get people to come along and feel what the house is like without any of that distraction. There's no kitchen to look at. There's no bathroom. But the moment you walk in, you feel the difference.
Yeah. I mean, going to the numbers side of it, is there a substantial up cost for going for the passive house build over a standard New Zealand house build? As
with any increase in performance, whether it's passive house or Homestar, if you are adding things to the specification or the design to make it better, then it's going to cost you more.
Yeah.
But that's the wrong way to design something. Yeah. You start with the end in mind. Everyone has a budget. You know what that budget is, and you start with what you want the building to do at the end. Then it doesn't cost you any more. The vast bulk of the cost of any building is in all the stuff that you're going to have to put in that building anyway.
Yeah.
So every building needs a roof, it needs walls, windows, foundation. That's where the cost is. The cost is not the bulk of the cost is not in going from the cheapest windows you can possibly afford to half decent ones that are thermally broken and maybe have the coating on them. That's an incremental increase, but the cheapest window is still a big cost. So the vast majority of the cost is in the process of designing and building any building.
Yeah.
The other thing that I see is far too much complexity.
Yeah.
Roofs these days are literally designed by a computer, and you look at a new roof and there are so many ridges and valleys in it. It's just ridiculous. And every one of those ridges and valleys is there because the designer or a salesperson in some cases has taken the floor plan and pushed walls out and pulled them in and created too many corners in the house. That doesn't mean you have to have a boring house or an ugly house, but if you simplify the envelope, it makes things a lot easier to design, specify, and build. Then you have a lot more of your budget available to make it perform well or properly, but also to look good. And I think some architecture has got a little bit lazy because they've just put floor to ceiling windows in instead of actually positioning a window to work well for both the view and also for daylight, and just a bit better, more thinking about the layout. That's a long way of saying that it doesn't have to cost more if you get in the project early enough. Yeah. And the biggest problem we have,
designing from scratch, if
you're designing from scratch, the biggest problem we have is someone deciding too late in the piece, or bringing a sustainability consultant on too late in the piece and say, "Hey, I designed this house, now make it sustainable." Yeah, you really need to start with that end in mind.
Well, one of the things I learned from working with Patrick way back when is that the siloed approach to design is the worst way to design anything. And he was very much a proponent of us as engineers being part of the design process from the very beginning. Before the architects put pen to paper, we should have an input, because if we're designing the systems that go inside a building that are going to use all the energy, then we want to make sure the building's optimizing the energy use. We don't want to be coming in after the building's designed and then trying to make the building energy work. And having that holistic view that treat the building as a complete system, as a living entity, and design it all at the same time, you get a much better outcome. Your energy input is much lower because the building's working for you and not against you. And that applies whether it's a house or whether it's a 100,000 square meter office. The same principles apply. And I think we do at the moment, certainly from what I've seen, we tend to be telling people to stick to their lanes. You do the architecture, you do the structure, you do the mechanical, you do the electrical, you do the plumbing, and don't talk to anybody else,
including the builder. And those builders that I talked about, they have some really good ideas, and so the tendering process tends to make things inefficient as well. If you can actually get the builder on board really, really early on, some of those builders are really smart when it comes to figuring out better design. They might not be able draw detailed construction plans, but they'll be able to tell an architect, hey, if you put this in this position, it makes us easier for us, then we can sequence it better in the construction. And they're definitely worth getting the builders on board early.
Is there anything else that you want to share at this point? Because where we're getting to the end of our time.
I've mentioned carbon. That's been the big surprise for me coming back to the New Zealand Green Building Council. I was really interested in the energy modelling, which was the big change for Homestar V5 was the incorporation of the passive house planning package, which is quite complex. But the benefit of Homestar is that it's taken the power of that modelling tool and brought it into something that's vastly more accessible for any architect or even a designer or a consultant. So that's really exciting. It means that people can have a much more predictive energy model, not just for the amount of heating they're going to need in winter, but critically for identifying the overheating risk, which most people don't know is not even part of the building code. Right. So that's another whole issue. Our building code has some big black holes. One is lack of ventilation. The other is that it doesn't require designers to think about overheating at all. There's nothing to prevent a brand new home from getting too hot, and more of them are. So that's a big issue. But carbon's been a bit of a surprise to me because, first of all, there's this thing called the TCFD, which is our Task Force on Climate Change Related Disclosure. That's a global group, and we are signed up to it. It's kind of where our emissions reduction target has come from as a country. That is driving real change and quite rapid growth in the industry of carbon accounting as a profession. And I'm telling any young professionals now, particularly if they're in quantity surveying or construction management, is to go and learn about carbon, because you're going to be very valuable in the near future, or starting now, because there's all the banks are requiring the numbers for any projects that they lend to. So they're going to have to do their financial model, but they're also going to be required to report on the likely upfront carbon of any projects. So that's a really exciting area.
Embodied carbon and carbon in construction element.
Yes. So embodied carbon is all the carbon that goes into the materials and the process of building a building, as opposed to the operational carbon. Operational carbon for us is also really exciting. It's kind of easy though, because we just take the energy efficiency or the energy requirements and convert that to the factors about 0.1 here in New Zealand. Embodied carbon is much more complicated, because you've got to figure out where all of your concrete's coming from, your steel, your timber.
I think the fact we send timber over to China to get it processed and bring it back to build over here is not helping our embodied carbon, is it really?
It's not. No. But it's a really exciting space. And what those calculations are doing is bringing essentially a big part of sustainability as a whole into a easily comparable number, which is CO2 equivalents per whatever, usually per square meter of building. Because there's a lot, it's not just carbon, it's global greenhouse emissions. So there could be other gases and other impacts there as well. But by bringing it into one number, we can actually say now, is this piece of steel better or worse than this piece of engineered timber for this particular project? Yeah. Because that's not always what you might think.
You talked briefly about that paper that's in consultation from MB about better buildings for climate change. Is there anything in that documentation around targets for embodied carbon?
Yeah, there are two parts to it. So there's reducing operational carbon. There are two basically booklets. You can download them. They're there on the MB website. There's the adaptation piece, and there's basically the embodied carbon and the operational carbon.
Okay, cool, excellent. I think what I'll do is I'll include the links to that on the show notes for this podcast when I publish it, so that if people want to read more, they can do just that.
Definitely, yep.
Okay, I'd just like to say again, thank you very much, Matthew, for taking the time to talk to me. It's been great talking
Pleasure.
to you. I hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to my podcast mini-series, A Penny for Your Thoughts on Sustainability. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like, share and follow for more episodes. Thank you.